Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Who's expecting to do a presentation today? No one. Okay. So we're running out of time to do a presentation. So if you don't have one, if you haven't done one, make sure you're scheduled. Okay. Well then. Yeah. So practice problems before the end of class up here for chapter 13. So speaking of chapter 13, let's finish it up here. Fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is about the government's taxing and spending. And so fiscal policy is the effect that the government policies on spending and tax transfers and tax collecting affects the larger economy. So an expansionary fiscal policy is that the government will spend more and or tax less. So if they spend more, they're pumping money in the economy. If they tax less, everyone has more money in their pockets. So they spend more. If the government decides that we should contract the economy, contract GDP, they can spend less, or they can tax more, or both, and that will slow things down. And how that looks like is on an expansionary policy, if we're below our potential output, we spend more or tax less, it moves aggregate demand to the right. Fiscal policy doesn't do much for aggregate supply, but it does a lot for aggregate demand. And if we want to contract things, we're too heated, we're above potential output, we want to get back to a more sustainable level to avoid inflation, we can spend less and tax more. Okay. Fiscal policy has a lot of critics. I think the real reason why it has critics is because it means it affects taxes and nobody wants to pay more in taxes, but the critics like to claim things like government spending crowds out private spending. And this is the idea that the government spending a bunch of money, then that means there's less money to be spent by the private sector. And that's not true. As we've learned in this class, basic economic concepts is that there's more money, more growth. We can always keep growing the pie. Second critique is that government borrowing will crowd out private borrowing. And this can be true under certain circumstances. And there is a finite amount of loanable funds. So much money is out there available to be lent out. And if we're at that maximum, then that does mean if the government is borrowing, that means there's less available for private sector, and or that means interest rates go up, the price of borrowing goes up. So that can be a critique, but not only on a rare circumstance. Most time we're not at that place, and private government borrowing does not crowd out private borrowing. And then the third critique here is that government, the budget deficits affect people's behavior. So if we're in an expansionary period, and then people won't spend that money because they're worried that their taxes will go up in 5 years. And that's just not how people work. It's a behavioral thing. It assumes behavior that most people don't exhibit. The real downside of fiscal policy is that there's a time lag. By the time we understand we're in a recession, to the time we want to do something about it, to the time politicians decide to spend money, to the time they actually pass a bill and spend the money, years and years can go by, at which time maybe the recession's over and we're now in an expansionary period, and then this extra spending in the economy will just overheat things. Okay. A lot of the fiscal policy relies on the multiplier, 1/1 minus MPC. So because people spend when they get income, if you put more income into the economy, they'll spend that, and it goes round and round, multiplying the effect of that initial spend. Well, then we also got a little more nuance this week and learning that that's for government spend, but what happens for government transfer when the government's transferring money, tax money from a large population to a smaller population like Social Security? Does that have the same multiplier effect? And it doesn't, because there's not that initial spend. So it goes around and around in the economy like it does with the spend, but there's not the first step. There's not that first spend. So we incorporate that in the formula by the change in transfer times MPC times 1/1 minus MPC. Okay, then we also learned a little bit about taxes. So we have a progressive non-lump sum tax system. So the more you make, the more you pay. So that means the more you make during good times, the more you pay. And the more you're paying, the less you have in your pocket to spend. So that slows down the economy. So tax policy acts as a automatic stabilizer. So when things are going great, taxes go up, and that slows things down. When things are going bad, we pay less taxes because we have less income, and less taxes mean we spend more. So taxes act as an automatic stabilizer, doing the opposite of what was happening in the economies, slowing down a speeding economy and speeding up a slowing economy. Okay, then we got into budget balance. So the government savings rate is what's left over at the end of the year after all the tax revenue is collected and all that transfers are done and all the government expenditures are done. What's left is a surplus if there's extra money left over, or a deficit if there wasn't enough money to cover all the spending and transfers, in which case they have to borrow. So we don't really care about, in the short run, about deficits or surplus, because they're so linked to the cyclical business cycle. So we want to run a deficit potentially in a recession because we want to spend money to get out of the recession. And we want to run a surplus during great times because we don't want to overheat the economy, we want to slow it down a little bit. So deficits and surplus is greatly linked to the business cycle, and we want that to be, but we also want to analyze in the long run if we are over the long run balancing out. So we can take out the cyclically adjusted budget balance to see what the long run effect is. Okay. So that gets us to the new material today. So long run implications of fiscal policy. So we don't care about public debt deficits in the short run because it has a benefit. We care about the long run. And in the long run, deficits add up to a debt. So if we had a deficit this year of $1 trillion because we spent $1 trillion more than we collected through tax revenue, then we borrow, and then next year we have to start paying that borrowing back. And if we run a deficit next year, another trillion, now we owe $2 trillion, and we have to start paying that back and pay the interest on it. That long-term debt may or may not be good, may or may not be bad. Let's look at it a little bit. So a deficit is the difference between the amount of money the government's receiving this year and what it's spending. And then over time, it adds up to a debt, typically in our country, because we're always running a deficit. And that debt is the accumulation of the deficits over time. So here, this is from 2017 or 16. These are on this axis here. These are the major countries, major economic powers, including us. And this is showing us that our debt to GDP ratio is 77%. So we're running a debt of about 77% of our GDP. Let's ignore Greece, because we've learned through one of the economics in action, Greece had a unique circumstance, but look at Japan. Japan is the third largest economy, very powerful economy, very rich country. They're running it at 127% debt to GDP. All these major countries are running a high debt to GDP. Except for Norway. Norway is another unusual circumstance because they are a very rich country with lots of natural resources like oil. And they have lots of government tax revenue from that oil, and they run surplus because of it. So why do we even care about debt to GDP? Remember, GDP is a sign of our wealth. It's a sign of our yearly income. So if our GDP is $20 trillion, that's like saying our national as a whole as economy income is $20 trillion this year. And we're spending 14 trillion of that on debt. Or we're not actually, I shouldn't say it, that was a bad way of saying that. We're not actually spending 14 trillion in debt because that's just what we have to pay back. So only 77% of that is debt. So we have a lot of high income. To that debt doesn't seem so bad. What are the downsides of debt? Well, public debt may crowd out investment spending. So we just talked about this, but one of the critiques of fiscal policy, and this applies here. Governments borrowing money. There's a finite amount of money available in loanable funds. So if the government's borrowing it, then there isn't that money for private sector. Or if the government's borrowing it, then it raises the price of borrowing debt across the board, raises the interest rate. So that's a downside of high debt. You remember, if the private sector and consumption and factory investment, if we're not investing in ourselves, that slows down long-run economic growth. Okay. In some cases, rising debt can lead to government default. Right? When governments borrow, they have to pay it back. Argentina defaulted. They borrowed so much, they couldn't pay it back. Other countries have done this too. It's rare, but it happens. So you might think, well, if government's going to just print more money, how could they ever run out of money? Well, some governments try to do that. They start printing more money. Led to World War II. Yeah.
So when you say crowd out, what do you mean exactly by that?
Yeah, do you remember there was that weird analogy last class about the hot tub? Where, you know, if the hot tub's full, somebody has to get out before someone can get in. That's what I mean by crowding out. There's only so much fun. So if the big 800-pound gorilla US government comes in and starts taking that funds, there's less available and it pushes some private people, private actors out. There's no money left over, so they're crowded out. So World War I, at the Treaty of Versailles, when World War I ended, the Allies got together and made Germany pay back every cent of every damage they caused. So Germany had this huge national debt, and they started printing money to get out of it. Started printing Deutschmarks, giving it to England, giving it to France, and that put them in hyperinflation. And so each Deutschmark was worth less, and so much less that people would literally take wheelbarrows full of money to the bank or to the grocery store. People would burn money to keep themselves warm because that's how valueless an individual Deutschmark was. People would line their wall. I mean, you can go into German houses today, and peel back the latest wallpaper and find a layer of 1920s money used as wallpaper. That's how valueless it was. So you can't print your way out of debt because it makes the money worthless, causes hyperinflation. Okay, so widely used measure, so this debt to GDP ratio, so this is what's showing over time. So 1940s and 2016, our US debt to GDP, we see during World War II, we started spending a lot, we borrowed all that. 30% deficit. But over time, things kind of even out. We have some spikes here. This is the OPEC stagnation period in the late 70s, early 80s. This is the Great Recession, and spend our way out of that. This is a tech boom of the 90s leading to a surplus. But over time, we are running at about a 0% debt to GDP ratio. What else causes? Could anybody else think of a bad reason for debt? So we have two here. May lead to government default, may lead to crowding out. What else there? What other reasons would we not want high debt? Well, I mean, if you owe a lot, I guess it depends on who you owe it to. Right? If you personally, yeah.
Hard to qualify for like other loans to build up other sorts of loans.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really, yes, that's true. So I guess so what we're borrowing for matters, because if we're borrowing to buy tanks instead of build roads, then we don't have that money to build roads. No, we don't have nice roads. That's definitely true. What about who we owe it to? Who do we owe it to? Yeah.
Well, for the most part, China, they buy a lot of it.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's some international relations
Yeah.
dilemmas with debt.
So who in China? Is it China government? Who do you think?
I'm not really sure. I would assume partially the government at least. But
Yeah.
I don't know.
This is a really common argument. So let's dive into it. And this is what I was getting at. So thank you. Yeah, so what does it mean by government debt? Well, the US government, for the most part, borrows money through selling US Treasury bills. US Treasury bills are sold by the government. Anybody can buy them. And you buy it, and it has a mature date of a year or 10 years. And you buy $1,000 bond, and let's say it's a year. Then in 1 year, they pay back the $1,000 plus a set amount of interest. Anybody can buy it. Most of that's actually owned by US citizens, and our own government owns their own debt. US citizens, US companies own the majority of it. Now, private actors throughout the world also own. So Chinese citizens own a portion. And we talk about China because the economy grew so much, and because it grew so much, a lot of them were buying treasury bills, and the Chinese government owns some. So is that bad? Is it the mob? Is China gonna, for the money that they are owned, it's not a huge percentage, it's not the majority, it's a less than the majority. I don't have the exact number, but the Chinese government and Chinese private citizens own a small percentage of that debt. What's gonna happen? Is it like owning money to the mob? Is China gonna come collect? Well, we have 10 aircraft carriers, so there one aircraft carrier that says they won't. They're not gonna come break our knees, right? Like it's a fallacious argument to say, oh, they're going to come, real China, they're going to come collect. Right? We spend our money making sure no one can come collect. So that's not really the argument. The other argument is that U.S. citizens and U.S. companies actually own the majority of that debt. So when we talk about that debt, and we're talking about this slide here. 11% of our GDP goes, our income goes to interest payments, to that debt, to treasury bills, 11%. So whatever, that's $1 trillion, just in interest payments. But the majority of that goes right into our economy every year. And we already learned about the multiplier. So if 600 billion of that interest payment is going right into private citizens and private companies, and then being multiplied by the multiplier, that is a positive thing in our country. So these are the real bad things about debt: potential default, hyperinflation, crowding out. That we're paying $1 trillion in interest actually benefits us, benefits the whole economy. That trillion in interest payments ends up being, 2.5 trillion because of the multiplier. Anybody know why we're talking about treasury bills? Anybody know why people buy them? Yeah.
They're very, very stable investments.
Yes, and a treasury bill is actually called the risk-free investment, or the rate that a treasury bill pays out is actually called the risk-free rate. Risk-free, meaning if you buy it, you're 100% guaranteed to get your money back. There's no risk. Now, is that true? Well, the only way that's not true is if we default. And do we default? Well, that's the unthinkable, that the US would ever default. Of course, every year, Congress threatens to not raise the debt ceiling, which is a form of default. Right? Every year they have to raise the debt ceiling, and senators and Congress people will hold back until they get their pet projects approved. And if we don't raise the debt ceiling every year, then we do default. So then that would mean people that own those treasury bills wouldn't get their interest payments, among some other things. Okay, let's talk about implicit liabilities. So what are implicit liabilities? These are those transfers we talk about all the time. They are not actually debt in a traditional sense, but they sure look a lot like debt. Because Social Security is a law that says the US government will pay out Social Security. So why it's not a traditional debt, like a treasury bill, because there's a law, it ends up being a debt. We can't get out of not paying it. So implicit liabilities are not counted in the official number, 77%, but they sure look a lot like debt. So economists argue about, should we add them into the debt? So you add the implicit liabilities and it ends up being from 77%, we end up being at like 100, 102% around there, maybe 110% these days because of some recent spending of debt to GDP. Again, does that matter? I don't know. Japan's running 127% debt to GDP. And they're going strong. So we don't really know what the upper limit is for a safe debt to GDP ratio. Japan always seems to be at the highest end, so we kind of follow them if they're doing okay. But that's with counting these implicit liabilities. So the biggest of these implicit liabilities is Social Security and then also Medicare. So the problem with Social Security and why it's a concern is that every person that's a United States citizen is entitled to it. Entitled means we can't get out of paying somebody. By being a citizen, you're entitled to it. And it's paid for by taxes coming out of current paychecks. So it's not a savings account that's you've been paying into your whole life. My paycheck today pays for my father's Social Security. And the problem is that baby boomers are a huge generation that's retiring en masse and they're living forever. Health advances, live a long time, 30, 40 years after they retire. And it's such a big generation that it went from, for every 100 people working, we supported 36 people in Social Security, to something like every 100 people working, or almost to 50 people in Social Security. So money's getting really tight. And in fact, there was a surplus to Social Security that they were holding. The government was holding in place, but then other politicians said, well, look at all that cash over there, let's get our hands on it. And they started borrowing from it. And anyway, that's really complicated outside the scope of this class, but the point is, there's this huge bubble in costs for Social Security. That is one of the reasons why how do we count it as debt? How do we make this? How do we make up for this? That in 30 years, our spending is going to go up by 2% for Social Security. But more importantly, healthcare programs, Medicare spending will go way up because healthcare is getting more expensive and because people are living longer. So this is a huge burden to our debt. Okay, so then the good news for these liabilities, these implicit liabilities, is that they're very controllable through fiscal policy. So we can build into the laws that impact this stuff, ways to reduce costs, reduce spending, to counteract some of the negative effects. An example being the Affordable Care Act built in control measures to help reduce future healthcare spending quite a bit. Through various ways. So like one thing you might hear all the time is out of control drug prices. Well, Social Security, or excuse me, Medicare can negotiate the cost of their medications with pharmaceuticals to lower the price for Medicare purchases. Okay. Yeah, so that's fiscal policy. Any questions? It's also clear. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I don't know if you could tell, but fiscal policy is the one of the biggest topics in this class, but we've been building up to it for weeks and weeks and weeks. So when it comes to the final fiscal, things like the multiplier and the big picture stuff, the stabilizers that are going to be important. But it's going to be so weird because it's a lot of stuff that kind of intuitively get. Well, let's start talking about monetary policy, because this is why all you guys took the class, I know, because we're talking about all this boring laws and stuff and math, but now we're going to talk about the cool stuff. What is money? So what is money? You ever thought about it? Anybody want to be brave and say what they think money is? In a philosophical way.
Kind of like an agreement between two person on a value of a thing.
That was great. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that was perfect. We're done. Thank you. Yeah, so exactly that. So money is something that has several features. And the end result is that people can kind of agree that it has some sort of value and to exchange between them. All right. So money is any asset that can easily be used to purchase goods and services. So it doesn't have to be dollar bills. Even in a modern economy, it doesn't have to be what we consider as cash. Right? In a modern economy, 80 years ago, 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression, certain localities started making handmade currency in the United States. Like the clamshell script in Pismo Beach. And this is just one example, and other examples have happened since the 30s. So some definitions here. So currency is what we think of as cash. Coins, dollar bills, $100 bills that are in circulation. So all the money, all the cash printed at the Federal Reserve is sitting there, hasn't been in circulation yet, is no longer currency. All the stuff, damaged bills have been taken out of currency, they're ready to be destroyed, no longer currency. It's cash, paper or coin money held by the public. It's currency. Okay, checkable bank deposits. It's also money. Now this gets a little bit more blurred in the digital age. But by checkable bank deposits, I mean the money in your checking account. Some of you might be asking, what's a checking account? Right? It's what your grandparents use, a check. I don't use checks. I'm sure none of you have ever written a check. I use a debit card or bill pay through my bank. But the point is that account that those funds are attached to is a checking account, and it's literally meant by law, it's allowed to be an account that is meant to be used to purchase goods and services in real time. The whole point of your checking account in the bank and how the law allows it to operate is that it can be used to draw from, to make purchases of goods and services. That's not the case with your savings account, or if you have any other account with a bank. Only that checking account is legally designed to be used to facilitate good purchase of goods and services. Okay, and the money supply, which we're going to talk a lot about the money supply for monetary policy, is the amount of total value of financial assets in the economy that are considered money. So let's get back to that. What is money? At a philosophical level. Well, money is anything that can be a medium of exchange and a store of value and a unit of account. So what is a medium of exchange? So it's something that people will accept for payment of goods and services. Right? It's not something that you accept for trading that you're going to consume. If you're going to consume it, it's a purchase. It's not an exchange. Right? There has to be some store of value. So it has to retain purchasing power over time. So an ice cream cone could never be money because it melts, goes away. What about Bitcoin? I think Bitcoin fails this test because it doesn't hold purchasing power over time because it could be worth a lot of money today and it could be worth nothing tomorrow. I don't know. This is a little bit more philosophical, but also Bitcoin, if there was a global power outage tomorrow, it would all disappear. How likely that is. That's probably a weak argument because the whole point of blockchain is to retain that, have that staying power. But it has a store value. Money has a store value. It has to have some legitimate way of having the same purchasing power over time. Maybe I shouldn't say same purchasing power because the value of money fluctuates, but reasonably same purchasing power over time. Yeah.
So when it says that it has to do with financial assets, does that include like stock you own? Because that, I mean, I think some people would call that an asset, but it could also be worth nothing tomorrow, kind of like cryptocurrency.
Yeah, we're actually going to get to that in a couple slides. But yeah, so is a stock money? And that's a good question. And I think the answer would be no in the most strictest sense. But could it meet some of these qualifications? Probably could, because you could use a stock as a medium of exchange. And You could use it as a store of value because it equates to a known value on the market if it's a publicly traded company. So I think technically it could be money, but we'll get to the most strict definition and we'll see why it's not in a second. So a unit of account. Money provides a yardstick of measuring the value. So you guys all know what the value of a dollar is. What can you buy with a dollar? A candy bar. Most of a soda these days. $10. Buy lunch. Buy a couple gallons of gas. You have there's this intuitive value of a unit of value of what you know a dollar or $10 or $100 is worth. How much is a pig worth? How much is a cow worth? How much is a handful of gold worth? The unit of account becomes very important because without an agreed upon value or some intuitive value of the money, we don't know what it's worth. In a bartering society, if I have cows, my neighbor has pigs, and the neighbor down the street has homemade tools or whatever, we have no idea how much it's valued compared to that. So if I go out and I find somebody that even wants my cow, I don't know how much of what they have to offer my cow buys versus how much that pig buys. So up until very recently in history, somewhere between the time we got off complete bartering to now, most money was a commodity. So it was either the commodity, it was either a gold coin or a handful of gold, or it was some kind of representative that represented a fixed amount of that commodity. So a dollar bill, like we think of a dollar bill, but that represented X amount of gold. And before there was, United States economy or modern economies where the government printed the cash, banks would hold the gold and then issue a certificate that you could trade with other people like money that represented so much gold that they held. Okay, that was a commodity money. It's used, whatever the money was, the cash was a medium of exchange that had intrinsic value otherwise. So it was a handful of gold, intrinsic value because it had some other use, or as a representation of that gold. All right, that's this commodity backed money. So you can use the gold, or you can use some representation of the gold. Right? And why do people want to use representation of the gold? Well, because gold's heavy, or whatever commodity you're using. It's heavy, it's bulky, it's hard to travel, it's risky. It's much less risky to carry something that represents that gold than actual gold because you get robbed. So a commodity-backed money is some kind of representation of that other thing that can be converted into it. So for the longest time in this country, if you had a dollar bill, that represented so much gold the US government had in Fort Knox, and you could go exchange your dollar bill for a tenth of an ounce of gold. So there's some problems with that. So one problem with that is the government's holding 100 tons or 100 million tons of gold to back all these dollar bills in circulation. That gold just sitting there is a pretty inefficient use of a precious resource. If it's just sitting in Fort Knox, it can't be used to make jewelry or anti-corrosive electricity conducting widgets or whatever you use gold for. Right, that's what you use gold for, right? It doesn't corrode and it conducts electricity.
Would war bonds be fit under this stuff?
War bonds would be like a treasury bill. So it wouldn't be backed by gold, it would be backed by the promise to pay at that time during World War II. Because, no, World War II wouldn't be backed by gold, but it would be backed by paying back money, which is then in this kind of situation backed by gold. So yeah, 2 steps away. So if you're using the gold that's just sitting there, very inefficient use of that commodity. So that's a problem. The other problem is that if you have 100 tons of gold sitting there, you can only issue 100 tons of cash. So it limits how much money you have in your economy. But then somebody got the idea, well, if I have 100 tons of gold, not everyone's going to come back in and reclaim their gold with their dollar bills. So I can issue 200 tons worth of dollar bills because only a small fraction of them will come collect it. And I can issue 300 tons worth of dollar bills because, you know, only a small, tiny fraction are going to come and collect that gold. But then if you have 300 tons worth of cash out there, but only 100 tons worth of backing it, is it really backed? Is it really a commodity backed money if you can't back it all? Well, you can see it, that line of thinking takes you to, well, why have commodity backed money at all? Let's get the fiat. Fiat's an old legal term that means the king, the ruler, has declared it. So fiat money is money that has value because the king, the government has ruled it has value. There's no commodity backing it. So we went off the gold standard years ago. And we say our money has value because we say it has value. Do you ever question that value when somebody gives you money? Why would you? Would you question that value if North Korea gave you some North Korea dollars? Yeah, and what's the difference? Yeah.
Government stability.
Yes, yeah. So our fiat money is not backed by nothing. It's backed by the hugest military in the world to protect the country. It's backed by the most stable and advanced financial market system. It's built by a public highway system and public infrastructure. So our fiat money is backed by the stability and wealth of this country, but it's not backed by gold or any other commodity. Not only is our money very stable, and you would never question using it, the world uses our money. 60% of our cash is held overseas. Fiat money is stable, and it's so stable that the whole world uses our money. You can go anywhere with a dollar bill in this world and find somebody that will take it happily, eager to take it, because they know it's stable. Okay. So let's get to Jackie's question. Actually, what is money? It's a stock money. Well, let's talk. And by money, we're talking about not philosophically. We're talking about how we classify it in economics and how the government classifies it. So we have 2 definitions of money. We used to have 3 mainstream ones. I had to learn about M3, but we don't use M3 anymore. We use M1 and M2. So M1 is the most liquid forms of money. So this is cash in circulation. And this is checkable bank deposits. And we talked about this, checkable bank in your checking account. The checking account is designed to be used to write a check or use your debit card to make transactions to pay for goods and services. It is not your savings account. And there's traveler's checks. Never seen a traveler's check in my life, other than in movies like National Lampoon's European Vacation. If you've seen that, that's an old movie for you guys, but They use travel as a kind of plot point in that movie, traveler's checks. Never seen them, but they're very liquid. But the mostly it's cash and checkable deposits. So M1 is consisting of the two, I mean, technically three, the two most liquid, use at any time to trade for goods and services. Nothing delays it. M2 is M1 plus a few other things. So savings deposits. That's your savings account. Why is that M2? Well, it gets a little blurry in digital age, but imagine before online banking, which is not too long ago, the 1990s, even the early 2000s. If the bank closed at 5 and you wanted to spend money out of your savings account, 5 on Friday, you had to wait till 8 a.m. on Monday to go into the bank and transfer money from your savings account to your checking account or withdraw money from your savings account, because there's no way to spend from your savings account. You don't have checks that draw on your savings account. You don't have a debit card that draws on your savings account. It's a little blurred now. Now you can get on your web page, your bank's web page account and transfer money. But even that, I guess, proves the point. You still have to take this extra step. So savings account is M2 because it's not perfectly liquid. There's still an extra step to get that money spent for goods and services. At the same time, you have time deposits, which are CDs, certificates of deposit. This is this type of savings account where you put your money into it and it's locked up for a year or 5 years or however long, and you get earned interest on it. So why is that here? Because you can actually withdraw that money at any time, like out of a savings account, but you have to pay a penalty. So it's a little less liquid. And then money market funds are types of mutual funds. A mutual fund is where people get together, combine their money, and then as a whole, the fund buys into different investments, most commonly stocks. But money market funds are mutual funds that buy into certain commodities that make it very liquid. So you can get your money out pretty quick. So that's what we define money. The most liquid of assets is M1, and then M1 plus a few other very liquid that just takes an easy step is money. And we call those easy step money near monies. So getting back to the stocks, does a stock meet this? No, because a stock is just a little bit farther away from near money because it does involve selling on the open market, and it's a couple extra steps. It's not quite as liquid. Of course, that's blurring. I mean, I could get on my phone right now, sell my stocks, and have money in my bank account in 30 seconds. So it seems like a savings account, but we don't really consider it that way. Okay, and this is showing you like what's in circulation throughout the world. So we're still the top dog. Currency in circulation. We have lots of cash around the world. We still are the most desired currency in the world with others. I mean, the Eurozone, the euro, if it was considered one economy, it's one currency, but if it was considered one economy, it would be the largest or one of the second largest. And the Eurozone, the euro is used around the world. So that's our biggest competitor. Okay, I think that's where we're going to stop today with this kind of like defining what money is, so you can think about it. And then we'll start talking about banks on Thursday and how the banking system works. Any questions on money? No? Okay, great. So let's take 5 minutes and then, oh, we don't need presentations, right? No one will do, oh, you have a presentation? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Cheers.
Okay, all right, so after a 5-minute break, you'll do your presentation. And did you upload it? Okay, great. Okay, let's go ahead and get going, and we'll have Pierce do his presentation on counterfeiting, I think.
I'm Pierce, and my presentation is on not so funny money. So it's a summary. The Peruvians have been making fake US dollars. They've been counterfeiting an increased amount, and now it's termed the Peruvian notes that they're making. They look very real and decorated very precisely. The dollars are made by cheap labor and then transported through dangerous areas and smuggled across the US, just like drugs and stuff. The $100 bill is not worth the cheap ink and paper used. That's why it's kind of funny that extremely decorated pieces of paper have little to no intrinsic value, even though they're $100 bills. So this is a riddle. If a fake $100 bill from Peru enters the US and is successfully exchanged for a good or service with nobody realizing it's a fake, who gets hurt? Does anyone want to take a stab at it? Does anyone want to answer it?
We all do. Is that the right answer?
That's the right answer. It's US taxpayers, because counterfeit dollar bills reduces the revenues available to pay for US government actions and circulates to US citizens paying more taxes. And the Secret Service carefully monitors the integrity of US money so this doesn't happen. So my second presentation is the history of the dollar. People used to trade goods, services, and labor for things. Gold and silver coins have been the main currency for centuries and uses lots of resources to manufacture. The US colonists didn't have enough gold or silver coins from Europe, so they used tobacco or clamshells instead. Commodity money is used as a medium of exchange that has intrinsic value in other uses. So like tobacco, you can smoke, but it's also used as currency. Before the Civil War, only private banks issued out paper money and promised that they could be redeemed for gold and silver. But the value of the dollar at one bank was different than at another bank, so it caused lots of issues. The Citizens Bank of Louisiana was one of the most successful banks in New Orleans, and they had they made a $10 bill note that was very popular, and it was called a Dixie. And it was named Dixie because Dix in French means 10. And New Orleans was founded by the French. After the Civil War, the US government started printing paper money that was called green bucks. In 1873, the government officially measured dollars in terms of gold, turning into commodity-backed money, a medium of exchange with no intrinsic value. Its ultimate value is guaranteed by a promise that it can be converted into valuable goods. So in today's money, here's a few terms. So we have currency in circulation, which is physical cash. There's currently $1.5 trillion in aggregate. The checkable bank deposits are like bank accounts and cards, amounts to like $2 trillion. And near monies are financial assets that can't be directly used as a medium of exchange, but can be readily converted into cash or checkable bank deposits. And fiat money, not flat money, fiat money, medium of exchange that derives entirely from its official status as means of payment. So we don't question integrity of a $1 bill. So the savings deposits are saving accounts. And money plays three roles. One, a medium of exchange, an asset that acquires an asset that individuals acquire for the purpose of trading goods and services rather than their own consumption. 2, store of value is a means of holding purchasing power over time. And 3, unit of account, a measure used to set prices and make economic calculations. And money aggregate is overall money supply, and that amounts to about $13.5 trillion in total money circulating in all forms. And the questions, suppose you hold a gift card good for certain products at participating stores. Is this gift card money? A gift card is money in the form of a card. Anything you purchase with it is money, but if there's no value left on the gift card, then it isn't money anymore because there's no money on it. Although bank accounts pay some interest, depositors can get a higher interest rate by buying a certificate of deposit or CD. The depositor pays a penalty for withdrawing money before the CD is due, which takes about months or years. Explain why they're not part of M1. M1 includes only money that is in circulation and can be used immediately. Money in CDs are held for a longer term, months or years, and is not in circulation like savings accounts, which makes it M2. Explain why a system of commodity-backed money uses resources more efficiently than a system of commodity money. Commodity-backed money measures it to something else of value like gold, whereas commodity money is not valued at a certain amount. Commodity-backed money is more efficient because it has a set value and is the same everywhere, like $1 equals X amount of gold. And the principle was number 5, principle gains from trade. The principle is gains from trade because when you exchange money, there is always someone benefiting from the trade with money. Imagine a world where you had to produce everything on your own, or if you wanted a refrigerator, you had to exchange something for equal value. Your TV, for instance. Society would not advance very far. With money being a middleman between the sellers and the buyers, it makes trading easy. You can buy anything physical with money. It's also a reward system where the person giving something away gets something back in return, or the person donating their time to their job gets rewarded with money. Chefs, janitors, teachers, dog walkers, you name it, all get rewarded for doing good deeds. But capitalism isn't always good. Money can be used to exploit people and do terrible things if it falls into the wrong hands. And in conclusion, the history of money goes back centuries and has advanced very far. Even today's new currencies being made, such as cryptocurrencies and NFTs. The future of money is ever changing, with the value of money never the same. Prices are always changing too. Gas prices, for example, have skyrocketed in the past months from the war, and globally, money has become so important in our everyday lives.
Sit down. Great PowerPoint, visually striking. I could teach a whole history class about topics you brought up, like the Louisiana Purchase and why we call it why we call it Dixie Book. But I'll save you the boredom of not doing that. But I will say I did something interesting that I think is interesting about the counterfeit is that the Secret Service Secret Service is responsible for fighting counterfeit and monitoring the integrity of our money. And what else does Secret Service do? Protects the president. Yeah. So does anybody know what came first? I would guess. Yeah.
It was the currency, right? Currency.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what the timeline was?
It was like late 1800s.
The Civil War, because we started issuing as a federal government money during the Civil War, the Secret Service was created to monitor the integrity of that money. It wasn't until 1901 when McKinley, I think, was shot, that the Secret Service was then tasked, so almost 50 years later, with also protecting the president. So the Secret Service, everyone is most famous for being the presidential detail, started as a way of counterfeiting, protecting against counterfeit. Okay. Well, sounds fascinating. Let's get out of that and let's do our quiz. So our quiz password, let me look it up. Fed, FED, lowercase.